All right, Chapter 1 of I Survived. The American Revolution will start off here. August 29th, 1776, Brooklyn, New York. Nathaniel Fox was too young to be fighting in the Revolutionary War. He was only 11 years old, but here he was on a blood soaked battlefield in Brooklyn, New York. Thousands of British soldiers were on the attack, and Nate was sure that he was about to die. Gunfire crackled through the air. Crack, crack! Cannon blasts shook the ground. Kaboom! Already one of Nate's friends was lying dead in the dirt, shot through the heart. And now Nate was running for his life. He tore through the thick forest, dodging trees and stumbling over rocks. His mind swirled with fear. Blood pounded in his ears. And then came an even more terrifying sound. Heavy footsteps right behind him. Nate whipped his head around in panic. Over his shoulder, he saw an enormous soldier chasing after him. The man's musket was aimed at Nate's back. Attached to the gun's tip was a killing sword, a bayonet. Nate ran faster, desperate to escape, but he could hear the man's pounding steps and his grunting breaths. "I'm not a soldier!" Nate wanted to scream, but it was too late. The man was closing in. Closer, closer, closer. Nate braced himself for the killing stab. He was sure this was the end. And then came an ear-shattering blast. Boom! Nate saw flames, a blinding light, and then the world went black. Chapter 2. 7 weeks earlier, July 11th, 1776, 12 noon in Norwalk, Connecticut. Nate crawled along his uncle's vegetable garden, tugging up weeds and flicking away fat green worms. The burning sun cooked his back. His muscles ached from hours of work. But even worse was the sound of his uncle's voice, barking through the open dining room window. His uncle was talking about the war with England. Nate peeked through the window. His uncle, Uriah Storch, was sitting at the fine wooden table. He was eating his noon meal with his best friend, Mr. Marston. Nate breathed in the delicious food smells, but there was nothing delicious about watching Storch gobble the leg of a roasted goose. Storch pretended to be a gentleman, but Nate had seen hogs with better manners. "George Washington should be hanged," Storch was saying, cracking the poor goose's bone with his large teeth. George Washington was the commander of the American army. Most people in Connecticut loved General Washington. They called themselves patriots, which meant that they were rooting for the Americans to win the war. But Storch and his pal were on England's side. Storch hated George Washington more than he hated the fleas that crawled around his curled white wig. Storch turned toward the kitchen and bellowed, "More meat!" Seconds later, Eliza hurried in, carrying a silver platter piled high with fresh goose. Eliza stood patiently while the men heaped food on their plates. She'd been up since dawn cooking this meal, but neither of the men thanked her or even looked at her. Nate hated living here with Storch, but Eliza had it far worse. Nate was his nephew. Eliza was Storch's slave. Nate caught Eliza's eye through the window. He pushed together his lips and puffed out his cheeks, his best Storch imitation. Eliza raised her eyebrow at Nate, a reminder that he'd better watch himself. Storch was always looking for an excuse to give Nate a whack with his walking stick. He would not be happy to see Nate's blue eyes peering through the window. Nate ducked away. He had hours of work left to do, but he needed a break from the heat. He went to a shady spot under the cherry tree and looked down at the Long Island Sound. He loved watching the ships sailing by. Nate closed his eyes and pretended he was on one of those ships, heading out to the open sea. His mind filled up with the sounds of flapping sails and squawking seagulls. He imagined a cool sea breeze ruffling his hair. He could practically feel his father's strong hand resting on his shoulder. Papa had been a ship's captain. After Nate's mama got sick and died when Nate was just 4, Papa started taking Nate along with him on his voyages. Nate grew up crisscrossing the ocean with Papa and his crews. What a happy life! Sure, not every kid would want to grow up on the sea. The creaking wooden sailing ships were crawling with rats. The stale, wormy biscuits could break your teeth. Nate's bed was a hammock hanging from the ceiling. But none of that mattered because Nate was with Papa. Nate pictured his father's green eyes flashing from under his old sailing cap, his black ponytail waving in the wind. He'd wrap his arm around Nate's shoulder as they stood on their deck, looking out at the endless ocean. "You never know what's ahead," Papa would say, his eyes brimming with excitement. But now a wave of sadness crushed over Nate. Papa died almost 2 years ago while they were sailing home from a trip to the Caribbean islands. The voyage had been smooth with steady winds and a glassy sea and even a crew of 10 men. Nate's favorite crew member was Paul Dobbins, a joking 18-year-old with bright red hair and a gap-toothed grin. He'd sailed with Papa before and had always treated Nate like a favorite brother. They had been halfway through their 3-week voyage home when they sailed into the path of a wicked storm. It came out of nowhere, a ferocious squall with swirling black clouds, pounding rain, and lightning that tore open the sky. The winds blew like dragon's breath, and waves crashed over the deck. Papa and the crew worked frantically, sliding across rain-soaked decks and pushing through the whipping winds. Giant, twisting waves spun the ship like a toy. The crew managed to take down the sails, but then a 20-foot wave grabbed hold of Papa and swept him off the deck. In a blink, he was swallowed up by the sea and gone forever. Suddenly, Nate was an orphan, with just one living relative in the world. The uncle that Papa had always hated. Papa had stayed away from Storch, a man as mean as he was rich. Storch was the last person Papa would have wanted Nate to live with, but where else could Nate go? Paul had promised to stay in touch. He had hugged Nate tight and sworn that he'd always look after him. "We're blood, you and me," he'd said. But that was just talk. Nate hadn't heard a peep from Paul in 2 years, and he had no idea why. Nate knew he should be thankful that Storch gave him a home. Plenty of orphans ended up as beggars. At least Nate had family to take him in. Except Storch had never treated Nate like family. A stray dog was more like it. It was Eliza who'd make sure Nate knew he wasn't alone in the world. During Nate's first months with Storch, he was tortured by nightmares. He'd wake up and find Eliza sitting by his bed. She'd be gripping his hand tight, like she'd just pulled him out of the churning sea. She was Nate's family now. Nate stood there under the cherry tree, his mind swirling with sad memories. He was so distracted he didn't hear the footsteps creeping up behind him. Something poked his back. A voice growled, "Back to work or I'll chop you up!" Chapter 3. Nate stood very still. "Are you a pirate?" Nate asked. "Yes," the vice said. "A pirate. I want my treasure." Nate's heart lifted up. He whirled around to face his attacker, 3-year-old Theo, Eliza's little boy. He was waving his pirate sword, a spindly stick from the cherry tree. Theo was supposed to be napping and out of Storch's sight, but here he was, wide awake. "You are very fierce," Nate told his friend. Theo stood proudly, his brown eyes gleaming like polished gold. He'd been wild about pirates for months now, ever since Nate started telling him stories about his adventures at sea. Theo waved his stick sword. "Arg!" he shouted out in his most pirate-like voice. Nate grabbed Theo around the waist and picked him up. Theo's happy giggles rose up, whooshing over Nate like a breeze. Seconds later, Eliza came rushing out of the house, her skirt swirling around her shoes. Eliza had Theo's same dark brown skin and big bright eyes, but unlike Theo, Eliza wasn't smiling. "You both need to hush," she warned, looking toward the house. "You know what he could do if he hears?" He, of course, was Storch. He had no patience for giggling, and even less for Theo himself. Eliza's worst nightmare was that Storch would sell Theo just like he'd sold Eliza's husband Gregory a few months before Nate arrived. Eliza rarely talked about Gregory. It hurt her too much, Nate knew. But she had told Nate a few things about her husband, that he was joyful like Theo and had those same bright eyes, that not 1 hour went by without her missing him.